Hey there everybody, welcome back to my RPG recommendation series, and this time we're going back to the era of blast processing, with the Sega Genesis slash Sega Mega Drive slash Sega CD. And again, I want to remind everybody that this isn't a top 10 list. It's not a top 10 list, this isn't the 10 best games on the Sega Genesis, it's just 10 RPGs that I think people should play on the Genesis or Sega CD if you want to count that as a separate thing. But anyway, I also want to mention that in this list I'm actually omitting a lot of more popular stuff that you should already know is good on the Genesis. So there's going to be no mention of Phantasy Star, and no mention of any of the Shining Force games, and no mention of any of the Lunar games. Everybody knows those are good. Everybody knows about them. If you don't, I don't know, maybe you're new to the Genesis. But if you're not new, you probably know those are some of the best RPGs around, so you don't need me to recommend those to you. But this time around, we're going to be looking at a lot of different types of games that don't get enough love, in my opinion, for RPGs. So, let's get into it.
Vi was released for the Mega CD in 1993, but didn't get a Sega CD release until 1994. When it was released in Japan, it was panned by Famitsu. I believe one reviewer actually gave it a 3. So in the US, though, it had a different fate. It was released just after Lunar, Silver Star Story, and was endlessly compared to that game, which gave people an excessively negative view of it. It's sad really, because taken on its own, Vi is actually quite a fun game. The story is definitely a strong point of this game. It combines elements of fantasy and science fiction to create a somewhat standard but still interesting narrative that is helped along by lots of great-looking animated cutscenes. The character sprites are somewhat small but relatively well detailed, while the monster sprites are larger and also well detailed. The maps and environments aren't incredible by any means, but aren't something I would complain about either. The sound effects are nothing special, but the Red Book audio soundtrack is great. Battles are third person, but are fought like Dragon Quest as the monsters are in rows in front of you. This game sort of has a reputation as being a game that's overly difficult and requires a lot of grinding, but I find that despite needing to grind, it's not that difficult if you choose a battle strategy that isn't only brute force. Though, admittedly, the scaling difficulty seems to be kind of broken at times. While Vi isn't the greatest RPG on the system, it's definitely worth your time.
The next game I'm going to talk about is one that I wasn't quite sure I was going to put in this list. It's not that I didn't think it was a good RPG that I wanted to recommend, it's that there's other versions that I couldn't decide which one would be the best one. But, in the end, the Sega CD version wins out.
Durai was released for the Mega CD in 1992, though it was released on various computers in 1989 and 1990, as well as on the PC Engine in 1991, and again on the Super Famicom in 1993. It had many releases, but I'd go with the Mega CD version for a few reasons. First, the play area is bigger and easier to see than the PC Engine version. It also has nice-looking full-motion animation, unlike the Super Famicom version, which is the least good of the three. Also, the text is bigger and easier to read, which makes the game in turn easier to play. The only downside to this version is that, due to the comparatively weak level of color display for the system, the graphics aren't quite as colorful as the PC Engine version. The story for the game involves the resurrection of a dark god named Daru who gives power to an evil army that begins taking over the kingdoms of the world. That sounds pretty simple, but the characters are actually portrayed quite well. There are 8 characters and each has their own sort of mini introduction story that's like a mini RPG for each character. It's a nice addition because, despite there being quite a few characters, you really get to know and like them all. The story even gets more complex about halfway through the game due to sort of a false ending after which the game continues. Beyond the somewhat dull color palettes, the Sega CD version of this game, in my opinion, is the way to go. Definitely check it out if you get a chance.
One of the good things about the Genesis is that, due to its popularity outside of Japan, it actually has a lot of Western RPGs instead of Japanese RPGs, which is actually a good thing. Probably half this list is non-Japanese RPGs, which is kind of shocking for the 16-bit era, but the Genesis actually has quite a few Western RPG gems. This is one of them.
Warriors of the Eternal Sun was released for the Genesis in 1992 and was developed by legendary PC dungeon crawler developer Westwood Associates. First, this game has a lot of unique elements to it. The first and most obvious being that it's based on Dungeons & Dragons rules. Now I know what you're thinking. Joe, there are plenty of Dungeons & Dragons RPGs on consoles and the computer. That's not so unique. Of course, if you are thinking that, you're wrong. These are all advanced Dungeons & Dragons games. As far as I know, this is one of the few games ever made based on original Dungeons & Dragons rules, and possibly the only other for consoles besides Order of the Griffin for the TurboGrafx-16. Regardless, it's definitely the only game ever set in the Hollow World D&D scenario, so that's definitely unique. Another interesting thing about this game is that there are two separate battle systems for above ground and for dungeons. The above ground battles are isometric and turn-based, while the dungeons are action-based like Westwood's other RPGs such as Lands of Lore. Both systems are easy to learn and handle though. The dungeon crawling parts are probably more exciting and fun, in my opinion. Another nice thing about this game is that character creation is pretty in-depth. You can create and re-roll characters to meet your needs, which is helpful for making customized parties. Though some might be confused by the class system, which includes races as classes, which is one of the things I never enjoyed about the original D&D rules. The story and setting for this game are also quite interesting. The Hollow World campaign setting is always an interesting one in my opinion, and it's handled rather well here. The story is rather simple but engaging, involving mostly figuring out where you are and how you were transported there. The game itself isn't overly difficult, it's comparatively short, and altogether fun. In my opinion, it's really underrated because it's not a 16-bit JRPG, and it's kind of a minor title on the Genesis made by a company mostly famous for computer RPGs. It's definitely something that you should try out if you haven't had a chance though.
The next game is absolutely one of the best RPGs on the Sega Genesis. I'm actually having a hard time thinking of a better one, but it's also probably one of the most underrated, as almost nobody talks about this game, which is sad because it's so great.
Illusion City, Gene Toshi, was released in 1993 for the Mega CD and was developed by Microcabin, who's probably most famous for the Zerk, Riglord, and Princess Maker series of games. Microcabin has always been a mystery to me though. They consistently made good games, but none of them ever seemed to blow up in popularity in the way that they should have. This game is no exception. Illusion City is a cyberpunk RPG with a setting that reminds me of a mashup between the first Shin Megami Tensei and Shadowrun. There has been a city, in this case Hong Kong, destroyed by a demon uprising, as well as demon hunters, but here the destroyed city is taken over and rebuilt by a corporation that declares it a sovereign country. The story involves figuring out the intentions of the company and why there are demons in the first place. This game doesn't quite fit the standard Japanese RPG mold of the time. The setting is near future, the character sprites are more realistic looking, the animated cutscenes are handled very nicely, giving you good views of the city and the environments, and it's suitably dark and grimy for a cyberpunk Hong Kong. This game doesn't have an overworld, and there are no random encounters. All of the city is connected and split into different sectors. The enemies appear on screen and can be avoided if necessary. The battles are turn-based and quite similar to games like Phantasy Star, where the combat takes place in an over-the-shoulder third-person view. Another interesting thing is that weapons are essentially all unlocked from the beginning of the game. You can buy them at stores, and the only real thing holding you back is money. Weapons have different effects as well, which adds a bit of strategy instead of the standard stronger attack equals better weapon formula. When it comes down to it though, the game has a unique look, it's interesting, it's got a somewhat edgy feel to it, and it's a cyberpunk dungeon crawler. If that sounds like something you're even remotely interested in, you should definitely give this game a playthrough.
The next recommendation is one of those love it or hate it type of games. If you like the game, you'll really like it. If you hate it, you'll hate it. However, it's an interesting and vast open world RPG. Something that's pretty rare on the Sega Genesis.
Rings of Power was released for the Genesis in 1991 and was developed by none other than creators of Uncharted and Jak and Daxter, Naughty Dog. This game is very different from other RPGs of the time, and I can't think of anything that's similar to it on the Genesis. It's an RPG that essentially throws out a lot of the standard RPG mechanics and replaces them with interesting ideas. First, the game is played on an isometric map. When I first played this game, I thought that the maps looked almost plucked from the game Populous. The characters move about in a way that's similar to games like The Immortal. Beyond the basic appearance, though, there are other major points. First, the game is completely open-ended. Maybe more open-ended than gamers today are ready to handle. First, you have only one major quest: find the Rings of Power. Other events happen, but that's the main quest: find the rings. You're thrown into it with no info, no map, and no quest log, and just have to figure out what you're doing and where to go. Of course, there are plenty of random events and quests you can go on throughout the game, but all of them are optional. If you want, you can even walk into towns and immediately slaughter everyone, though really you'll probably kill someone you need in order to beat the game, so you probably wouldn't want to do that. As I said, it's open-ended, and you can actually search for the rings in any order, and go anywhere right from the start. I often found myself wandering aimlessly only to accidentally come across places that held a ring. The game has 6 character types, though essentially everyone's a wizard. There are no weapons or armor in this game, only magic spells. There are quite a few spells for each class though, so variety is still there. Battles are turn-based and offer a bit of a challenge if you're unprepared. If you really want to check out a very old-school, open-world, non-linear RPG on the Genesis, this might be your best bet. It might be your only bet.
The next game is another interesting one, but it's also another really obscure one. If you watch my TurboGrafx 16/PC Engine recommendations, you'll at least recognize the series, but again, this one's pretty rare.
After Armageddon Gaiden was released in 1994 and is kind of a continuation of the story in Last Armageddon on the PC Engine, in that game, you had demons fighting robots for control of the planet. This game takes place about 200 years after that story, and the world is quite different. Again, humans exist on the planet, and the demons are born to serve the humans. However, you play as a party of demons who aren't happy with this setup and set off on your own. In comparison to the first game, this has been very much simplified. Gone are the 3 types of parties in favor of a single party that you use throughout the game. Also, instead of the genetic exchange or whatever it was in the first game between monsters, evolution of characters is performed by eating humans. As far as graphics go, this one, while again not as varied in color as the PC Engine version, looks quite good. The sprites are bigger, and because the text is larger, the game is actually easier to play. The game itself is actually pretty open. There are main areas to visit, but some can be completely skipped, and there are other optional quests to perform as well. The whole game system has been completely overhauled in order to clean up a few of the complaints about the first game, like the crazy encounter rates and the huge amount of grinding you had to do due to having 3 parties. I find the first game to have a better story overall, but this one is interesting because it has an opposite setup to a standard RPG, with demons fighting humans instead of the opposite. This game has rumored to be the final working designs translation for the Sega CD, but was eventually cancelled due to the release of the Sega Saturn. It's unfortunate too, because although this game is essentially a side story, it's still one that you should check out.
The Sega CD is home to some fantastic first-person dungeon crawlers. Usually, these are PC ports, but for home consoles, the Sega CD always had the best versions. Or in this case, the only version on home consoles.
Dungeon Master 2: The Legend of Skullkeep is a game that classic dungeon crawling fans will recognize immediately. The first game in this series, along with others like Wizardry, was a huge influence on the genre and was ported to multiple systems. You can still see its fingerprint today on games like Legend of Grimrock. Originally, this game was a PC game and was ported to the Mega CD in 1993. It did receive a US version in 1994 though. With this series in particular, even though it's made by a Western developer, it was released first in Japan. There's actually, in the series, a few games that were only released in Japan. Fans of the series will realize right away that this version is different from its predecessors. First, it's not entirely dungeon-based. While the first game saw you trapped in a multi-level dungeon with no way out but to travel through the dungeon, this game actually has non-dungeon areas. You'll find towns and shops and various locations to travel to and from. Of course, the latter half is almost all dungeons. The main gameplay involves traveling in first person between areas, and then through dungeons, all the while solving sometimes rather difficult puzzles and fighting in real time various monsters that appear. Pretty standard dungeon crawler stuff, but Dungeon Master 2 takes it to a level of near greatness. The maps and levels are designed quite well, the puzzles are actually challenging, and the enemies keep you on your toes throughout. The only real downsides to this game that I can think of is that they probably could have done a better job with the graphics. It's not a terribly good looking game, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't really been spruced up from the VGA PC counterpart that was released a few years earlier. The pacing might also be a bit slow for some. I personally don't have a problem with it because it's actually pretty faithful to the PC version and other versions of the game, but a lot of people complain that the game is very slow. Overall, this game and this series is an absolute classic in the first-person dungeon crawling genre. If you're a fan of the genre, definitely check this one out.
As I've mentioned, the Sega CD received a lot of ports from other systems, including the Super Nintendo and TurboGrafx-16. But sometimes those ports didn't turn out so well. Sometimes they looked worse, or had less colors, or sometimes just weren't as good. In some cases, though, the Sega CD version was the best version. Easily the best version for the 16-bit consoles. In this case, it's definitely that.
Shin Megami Tensei was developed by Atlus and released originally in 1992 for the Super Famicom. It was later ported to both the PC Engine and the Mega CD, though comparatively, for 16-bit generation machines, the Mega CD version of this game is hands down the best version. First though, let's talk about this amazing game. It's first-person dungeon crawler with turn-based battles. The main feature that the series is known for is the demon summoning and fusion mechanics. The game allows you to negotiate with and recruit demons into your party as members. They can then be fused together to create stronger demons. The story takes place in modern-day Tokyo, where a portal for demons to enter the real world has been accidentally opened, and people start to use the demons to try to control things. The city is already doomed, though, as the US has launched missiles in order to contain the demon threat. In this environment, you are tasked with surviving and siding with a faction in order to determine how the city will be ruled in the future. The series itself is wildly popular, so I won't go into it too much, but I do want to talk about why the Mega CD version is the version to have. First, the sprites have all been redone. While slightly pixelated, look improved. There has been an intro movie added. When moving, there's actual scrolling of the environments as opposed to the kind of warp from square to square method that the other versions use. Also, text size is increased, making it easier to read and allowing for the use of kanji in the game, which is helpful when reading the game in Japanese. Personally, I absolutely love this series, so you should definitely expect to see it show up again in later lists. If you haven't played any of these games, you're really missing out on a great RPG experience.
Next, we're going to be looking at another first-person dungeon crawler, and if you haven't figured it out yet, I really like this genre of games. But this is a game, actually, that I played obsessively on the PC when I was in junior high. And the Sega CD port adds some extra bonuses. So let's take a look at it.
Eye of the Beholder was originally released on the PC in 1991, and was eventually ported to the Sega CD in 1994. It was developed by Westwood Associates, who you may recognize as the company that I mentioned earlier who developed Warriors of the Eternal Sun. They also developed the Lands of Lore series as well as Command & Conquer. Eye of the Beholder is the quintessential first-person action dungeon crawler, and pretty much defined the genre from that point forward. Of course, it was wildly popular due to its use of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons license, but as gameplay goes, it's definitely a solid base for a genre that Westwood only improved later on. The story is somewhat standard for this type of game. You're trapped in a sealed-off dungeon and must progress through to find treasure and defeat a final evil boss. In this case, the eponymous Beholder. If you know AD&D and you know Beholders, you know that they're fearsome creatures, so fighting one is definitely a dangerous task. I remember when my friend and I first made it to the Beholder in this game, we totally freaked out, just ran away. This being a port from DOS, it's again not exactly the best looking game on the system. The graphics seem dated, as they are from 1991, but if you look beyond that, the gameplay and the puzzles are fantastic. You can choose from various character types and create your own unique teams of 4 to travel through the dungeon. It's actually a lot of fun doing this, especially when you start putting artificial restraints on yourself, like making an all-thief party or playing with only clerics and mages. Though even without that, the game is suitably challenging. Another thing to note about the Sega CD version is that the soundtrack is composed by Yuzo Koshiro, who did the soundtracks for games like Ys Book 1 and 2, Streets of Rage, Shenmue, and the recent dungeon crawling series Etrian Odyssey. The songs are techno-based, but somehow seem to fit. The best part is that they're Redbook audio, so you can listen to it on a regular CD player if you're so inclined. Frankly, you're doing yourself a disservice if you haven't played this game. On consoles, the Sega CD version is the best version by far. Definitely look for it if you have a Sega CD.
The final game I'm going to talk about is another one that I would consider one of the best on the Genesis. If I were to actually make a top 10 list, this game would still be on here.
Shadowrun was released in 1994 for the Genesis. It's based on the tabletop cyberpunk role-playing game of the same name. The world of Shadowrun is one that I've always enjoyed. I briefly played the tabletop RPG and had a huge stack of books for it. It's definitely a rich and interesting world setting, and this game captures a bit of it quite nice. First, it's a cyberpunk game, so of course it's futuristic, involves a lot of mega corporations with immense power, and has a lot of cyber and hacking elements. What Shadowrun also has, though, are fantasy RPG characters. They're elves and dwarves and orcs, as well as magic and magic users. It makes things quite interesting with the blend of magic and fantasy with computers and future technology. The story is a basic revenge story. Your brother is killed and you come to Seattle to find his killers and take revenge. That's the basics of the main plot, at least. The game itself consists less of that and more of you performing various Shadowruns, which are essentially quests to get enough money, Nuyen in Shadowrun, and Karma, which is experience in Shadowrun. You can also choose from 3 classes: Street Samurai, which is your combat class, Shaman, which is the magic user, and Decker, which is your technology-based hacking class. The only problem with these 3 classes is that at later levels, the Street Samurai and the Decker almost end up the same, whereas Shamans are more difficult to play, but they have an entirely different gameplay style. The gameplay is fun and engaging. Most of the time, you'll be spending your time doing various quests in order to get money to hire help and upgrade your weapons, armor, tech, or magic. A lot of the fun of the game comes from hunting for the latest and greatest tech in order to more easily complete missions or hack computers. Another interesting part in the game is the world itself. Of course, there are plenty of grimy Seattle scenes and it looks quite good, but there's a whole other part of the world, the Matrix. It's essentially a hacking world where you have an avatar called a persona, and you travel around to steal files, money, and info. Of course, there are defenses in the form of ICE, which are security programs of different types. They do various things as well. Some ICE will damage your hacking deck, and others will actually delete expensive items and programs for your inventory, while others will just straight up hurt you. As you progress and your reputation grows, you gain access to areas you couldn't access before, and you can even join up with crime organizations like the Mafia and the Yakuza. There are a lot of options in the game, and the more powerful you become, the more opens up to you. It's also completely open and mostly non-linear. When it comes down to it, this is an absolute gem of an RPG on the Genesis, especially for those who like cyberpunk settings. There aren't a lot of cyberpunk RPGs, but out of the few that there are on consoles, the Shadowrun games are easily some of the best.
So, that wraps up another RPG recommendations list. I hope you were able to find some good or interesting RPGs that you didn't know about before. So, next time, we're going to be looking at Nintendo's first juggernaut. Nintendo's first 100 million seller. That's right, you guessed it. The Nintendo Game Boy. Until then, see you next time.